What's wrong with this world?
Why does it feel so hopeless?
Why does life feel so hopeless? Is there anything
any good
anymore?
What's the point?
What's the point?
When will it end?
Will it ever be normal again?
Will it ever be normal again? What is normal?
When will it end?
How did it get so bad? How did we get here?
Is there a way out?
Is there a way out?
Does God even exist?
Does God even exist?
To really understand meaning, we have to go back to the beginning, to a point where there was God and there was only God. In himself, he was sufficient and he was complete and he was satisfied. And yet God, in his infinite wisdom, made an incredible decision. He decided that he would create something that was not himself. And so God's majestic voice thundered into the silence of nothing. Let there be light. And light sprang into existence, radiant and pure and bright. And God continued to create, and he layered land and sea and air, and plants sprang from the ground, lush and vibrant. God spoke fish into the sea, and birds into the air, and animals on the land. And God paused, and he looked at this incredible creation that he had made, and he saw that it was good. And yet on the sixth day, God pondered something different. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit planned a new creation. A creation that would have authority over the rest, that would oversee it and care for it. But mostly, God designed this creation to relate to him, to love him. And God made man, and he made them male and female, and he set them in the garden, and they lived in this incredible creation, and they tended it, and they cared for it, and it cared for them. But God would come and he would take walks with this creation, and he would talk with them, and he loved them, and they loved him. But this creation had another ability. This creation could also think and dream and desire and betray. As Adam and Eve lived in the garden, they faced an ancient foe. Satan appeared to them as a serpent, and he slithered into their thoughts, and he planted doubt. He said, God surely didn't tell you that you can't even touch the fruit from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, right? And that's not at all what God had said. God said, don't eat that, basically, because you don't want to know what you'll learn. But Satan made them look at God and made them wonder, is he good? Does he love us? Maybe he's holding out. And so this new creation that had the ability to reason and to dream and to think and to hope began to wonder, is what's bad good? Is what's dark light? And so slowly, I have to believe they hesitated, but they slowly reached toward the fruit. And as they grabbed hold of it and they made that fate-filled decision, do we follow or do we flee? Do we choose what looks good or do we choose what is good? As they made that fate-filled decision, they grabbed a hold of darkness and it grabbed a hold of them. And as darkness flowed through their whole being, everything changed. Where there was love, there was fear. Where there was joy, there was pain. Where there was hope, there was sorrow. And God entered the creation as He always had to come and take a walk with them. And suddenly, as they heard Him call, they didn't hear their loving Father. They didn't hear their delightful friend. They heard an angry judge. They heard someone who they thought would bring pain and punishment. And so they hid. They hid from God. They hid from each other. And when God finally found them, He said, "What did you do? How do you know? Why are you hiding from me?" And they blamed each other. Adam said, "It was her. She did it." She said, "It was the serpent. He made me do it." But suddenly, the relationship was different. The relationship was broken. They hid and they lied and they fled. And because of this fateful choice, they had to leave the garden. They couldn't stay where things were perfect because they were no longer perfect. And as that darkness laced through their being, they headed out into a world that was going to be filled with anger and fear and loss.
I heard a poem one time.
And it ends with this line.
I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul. And that left me with selfishness,
Doubt,
hiding,
fear,
lust,
selfish,
pornography,
broken,
loneliness.
loneliness.
I had one goal in life.
I had one goal in life: to make me happy.
To make me happy. And on this pursuit of happiness,
On this pursuit of happiness, I struggled to just survive.
I struggled to even survive. Every day I became more broken.
Every day, I became more lost.
And in my pain, I hurt people.
In my pain, I hurt myself.
I remember that moment.
I remember that moment
Rock bottom.
when I gave up.
I was broken,
Broken,
alone,
alone,
lost.
lost. I looked around, trying to find an answer.
And I looked around, searching for somebody I could blame.
That was the scariest thing.
And that was the scariest thing. I had chosen this.
It was right in front of me the whole time.
I ran away.
I didn't see it.
For thousands of years, the darkness followed them, pushed them. Every now and then, it seemed like maybe they could fight it, like maybe they could push it off. But it was always there, tainting and corrupting and distorting them. They longed to find life and joy and hope. But because of the darkness, they only found discouragement and sadness and separation. God knew their suffering, and He mourned the loss of relationship with them. And so again, God spoke. But this time was different. Instead of speaking words that brought light, God Himself came as the Word who is light. Jesus became one of us. He lived among us. He taught. He laughed. He healed. But more than anything else, Jesus loved. He showed us who God is, what He desires, what kind of being He is by the life that He lived. And what His life revealed was a love for those who had chosen darkness. And so He loved the prostitute. He loved the tax collector. He reached out and He touched the broken leper. And when the outcast came home, He opened His arms and He held him. Jesus came as the light of the world to show us the reality of who God is. And in the Word, we see the light. After His allotted time, Jesus sat alone in another garden. But instead of this brand new garden creation that God had made at first, this was the garden of an olive press. This is where fruit was pressed to produce oil. And Jesus sat there facing His own pressing. And He faced a decision. The decision was the same one that Adam and Eve faced. Would Jesus look at good and see bad? Would He look at light and see darkness? And make no mistake, Jesus knew exactly what He was looking at. Adam and Eve chose in part out of ignorance. Jesus was fully aware of what this decision would cost. Jesus wasn't afraid of being betrayed. He wasn't afraid of being tried or being beaten or being mocked. He wasn't even afraid of death. Jesus knew the cost was much greater than that. He knew that as the one who had spoke light into the darkness, He was facing becoming the darkness. He knew that He was facing stepping into my shoes and my faults and my failures, and not just taking a physical beating on Himself, but He knew that He was facing that moment of separation from the Father that Adam and Eve chose as they reached toward that fruit, and that you and I choose every day when we decide to choose what's wrong. Jesus knew He was facing that. And that decision was so heavy on Him. It was so hard for Him that Scripture tells us literally blood fell from His face like sweat. Why? Because He understood. He understood what that first decision had cost Adam and Eve, and He had watched thousands of years as they lived out the pain and the separation and the uncertainty that sin brings. He knows what separation from the Father is. He knows the pain that he faces. And he sits there and he faces the choice of, will I choose this for them or will I choose ease for me? And so he rose from the garden. He walked with the guards. He endured the beating. He endured the shame. He stayed silent during the trial. And when the moment came, he picked up the cross, which is really my cross.
Then there was a moment that I will never forget.
There was a moment that I will never forget.
Despite everything that I had done, despite the fact that I ran away,
despite the fact that I didn't know who he was, God found me.
God found me.
It was in that moment of searching.
It was in that moment of pain I realized that this was the very thing that Jesus died for.
I realized Jesus died for me.
I had made a choice to run away.
I had nothing left to run to.
He made a choice to find me.
He ran to me. He found me.
And for the first time in my life,
For one of the first times in my life,
I began to feel
hope,
true love,
peace,
peace,
trust.
joy.
I wasn't alone anymore,
I wasn't alone anymore.
all because of the cross.
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 The cross. It was meant to horrify the world. It was meant for humiliation. It was meant to last for days. It was meant for slow asphyxiation. It was meant to prolong torture. It was the Roman soldier's job. It was meant to be used by Caesar, but instead, it was used by God. It was meant to stop a movement, but instead, it became the way. It was meant to act on fear, but instead, it awakened faith. It was meant to be vicious and violent, but instead, it became our peace. It was meant to uproot hope, but instead, it became the seed. It was meant to punish captives, but instead, it unleashed freedom. It was meant to build up Rome, but instead, it built God's kingdom. It was meant to discourage rebels. It was meant to stop insurrection. It was meant to put down Jesus, but instead, it set up his resurrection. It was meant to jeer and mock him, but instead it was his glory. It was meant to erase a chapter, but instead it became the story. It was meant to hold up convicts, but instead it raised up a king. It was meant to shut our mouth, but instead it's why we sing. It was meant to be a judgment, but instead it became our mercy. It's why the song of heaven is the Lamb. The Lamb is worthy. It was meant to kill an enemy, crush dissenters and diversion, but instead it became the banner of God's love for every person. It was meant to be appalling, nailing hands and feet to wood. It was meant to be used for evil, but instead it was used for good. It was meant to be a symbol of God's assassination, but instead, it became the symbol of Jesus' invitation. Come to the cross. Instead of sin and stain, you are meant to be made clean. Instead of being forgotten, you are meant to know you're seen. Instead of being ashamed, you can leave behind your guilt. Instead of feeling empty, you were meant to be fulfilled. Instead of being broken, you are meant to be made whole. Here, Calvary is calling. It beckons you. Behold, come to the cross. Instead of being an accident, you have a purpose and a plan. Instead of being abandoned, you were chosen by His hand. For all who've said I can't, God has said I can. No matter what you've done, the invitation stands. Come to the cross. Instead of being doubtful, you are meant to know your Father. You are meant to be His son, and you are meant to be His daughter. You were cherished from the start. You were always in the picture. Instead of being a victim, you were meant to be a victor. The result of Jesus' blood, salvation has arrived. Instead of being dead, you are meant to be alive. The cross. It was meant to signal death, but instead, it's a sign of living. It was meant to be the end, but instead, it's our beginning.
As Jesus hung on the cross, bearing my sin, my shame, my pain, His enemies thought they had won. They thought this wasn't the end of the battle. They thought it was the end of the war. They thought His death was the final statement in a life that was basically a lie. And even Jesus, as He hung there, said one final phrase of His earthly life. As He breathed His last, He said, "It is finished." As they heard that, they thought He meant just Himself. They thought He meant His battle, His journey. But that's not what He meant at all. What He meant was the war was done. Because the darkness was overcome. Jesus came as the light of the world, and in that choice, the light became darkness, and on the cross, the darkness died. And as the darkness died, He rekindled the fire, the flame that is the light of God Himself. Jesus' first followers didn't understand that at all. They heard Him say that, and they thought what we think through so much of life. What's this thing about? What happened? What do I do? They were in a complete state of confusion and uncertainty. What they didn't remember was that at that Last Supper, Jesus had taught them exactly this. He had showed them this was the path, this was the plan. This isn't the end of the battle, it's the end of the war. And in that Last Supper, Jesus gave them words. They're words that they would cling to through persecution and pain, through torture and death. They're words that have rung through God's people for centuries. And the words continually point us to the cross. The words are, "This is my body, which is broken for you. This is my blood, which is shed for you." And as we hear those tonight, and as we hear them over and over again, let's also hear, it is finished.